Hello, I'm Matty Dalrymple, and welcome to From Expertise to Authority, where we examine how you can build your professional presence for a sideline or second act. More resources are available at theindyauthor.com, and that's Indy with a Y, including a downloadable worksheet you can use to document your journey from expertise to authority. In this episode, we'll be exploring From Void to Dialogue, turning invisible engagement into real connection. And if you'd like to read the article, you can find that at Matty Dalrymple on Substack, and you can also listen on the From Expertise to Authority podcast. In an earlier episode titled Publishing into the Void, I made the case that silence after you publish authority-building content is not evidence that your work isn't reaching people. It's just evidence that most engagement is invisible to the creator. Your readers and listeners may be absorbing your ideas, applying your frameworks, even recommending your content to colleagues, all without generating a single notification on your end. You might respond to this perspective by pointing to quantitative measures, podcast download numbers, page views, subscriber counts. And those metrics have their uses, but this article is about mindset, not analytics. And in my experience, the numbers rarely tell the story you think they're telling anyway. Downloads don't necessarily mean listens. Someone may have subscribed to your podcast months ago and never pressed play, painting an unrealistically optimistic picture of your reach. Conversely, your content may be getting forwarded in emails, discussed in private groups, or recommended in conversations you'll never witness. Real engagement that's completely invisible in your dashboard, painting an unrealistically pessimistic picture. The metrics measure what's measurable, which is not the same as measuring what matters. Accepting the gap between engagement and interaction is important, but it's not the end of the story. Once you've made peace with that reality, the next question is, how do you encourage the invisible engagement to become visible? And how do you nurture it when it does? First, be accessible. At professional gatherings, we've all seen the keynote speaker who hurries through the venue without making eye contact, or the headliner who retreats to a private dinner with fellow presenters, rather than lingering in the spaces where attendees gather. I understand the impulse. There are legitimate reasons to protect your time and energy, and I imagine that at a certain level of visibility, the demand for interaction can become genuinely overwhelming. But I wonder what those barriers cost over the long term, even for those whose authority seems well established. The audience members who wanted to share how a particular talk had affected their work, the aspiring professionals who had a question they'd been waiting all day to ask. Those are the interactions that deepen a speaker's understanding of their audience and that turn a one-directional presentation into the beginning of a relationship. For those of us who are still building authority rather than managing an abundance of it, the calculus is even clearer. Accessibility is one of the most valuable things you can offer precisely because so many people in positions of authority don't offer it. Accessibility takes different forms. Sticking around after giving a presentation is something I do without fail. I enjoy interacting with people in person, one-on-one or in small groups, and I strive to make those post-presentation interactions not just a continuation of my presentation, but true conversations. They are also fantastic opportunities to better understand the people you want to reach and the issues they're struggling with. And speaking of struggling, I will freely admit that one of the routes to accessibility that is less comfortable for me is interacting with people online. I know that I should respond to comments on social media and other content platforms with something that acknowledges what the person actually said, not with a generic thank you for watching or reading or commenting. But I am often stumped about what that might be. Interacting online simply isn't where my energy naturally flows. Fortunately, you don't need to be equally good at all the avenues for encouraging accessibility with your audience. You need to recognize which ones you're strongest at and lean into those while working on the ones that don't come as easily. And remember that although each interaction may be small, the effects will compound over time by demonstrating that you're a real person who values their engagement and not a broadcasting tower sending content into the atmosphere. Being accessible to the audience you want to reach is the key. In the early stages of building authority, when your audience is small, this accessibility is not only feasible, but natural. You have the time and bandwidth to respond to every comment, to remember the names of the people who show up repeatedly, to treat each interaction as the beginning of something rather than a task to manage. This is an advantage that the more established figures often can't replicate even if they wanted to, and it's worth recognizing as such rather than wishing you had an audience of their size. Second, solicit input. Being accessible means lowering the barrier for people who are already inclined to engage. Soliciting input goes a step further. It actively invites your audience into the work. I do this through my email newsletter, where I periodically ask subscribers specific questions: how they consume podcast content, audio, video, or transcript, which social media platforms they use to learn about new episodes, what topics they'd like to hear explored. The response rate is often modest, but what matters is the signal these questions send. that I consider my audience's perspective relevant to the decisions I make about my content, and that their input shapes what I create. People who feel invested in your work become your greatest allies. They share your content not because you ask them to, but because they feel a sense of ownership in it. They mention your podcast or book or consulting service to a colleague as something they have helped shape, even if their contribution was a single survey response. Kevin Kelly's famous essay proposed that a creator needs 1,000 true fans to sustain a career. But 1,000 true fans don't materialize all at once. They start as a dozen people who felt their opinion mattered, who received a thoughtful response to a comment, who saw their feedback reflected in the direction your work took. Nurturing those first dozen relationships with the same care you'd bring to 1,000 is what makes the eventual growth possible. The practical application is straightforward. Ask your audience what they think. Not in the abstract, let me know your thoughts, but in specific answerable terms. What format do they prefer? What topics resonate most? What questions are they struggling with in their own professional lives? Each question is an invitation to participate, and each response is a thread you can pull to deepen the connection. Third, accept that engagement follows its own logic. Even when you're doing everything right, being accessible, soliciting input, creating openings for interaction, you can't dictate what your audience responds to or how they choose to engage. I learned this through my own experiment. For years, at the end of every episode of the Indie Author Podcast, I posed a question for listeners to consider and invited them to share their thoughts on YouTube or on social media. It was a reasonable strategy, but the interactions that actually materialized were rarely driven by those questions. They were driven by the guest and their topic, by something in the conversation that struck a nerve or answered a question the listener had been carrying around. The engagement I designed for didn't arrive on schedule. The engagement I didn't anticipate showed up on its own terms. I recently stopped including the end-of-episode questions altogether, not because I'd given up on engagement, but because I'd accepted that the mechanism wasn't generating the interaction I'd hoped for. Your job is to create the openings, to be accessible when people step through them, and to resist the urge to interpret the form of the engagement as a measure of its depth. Fourth, building a dialogue, not a following. The shift from publishing into a void to building genuine dialogue with your readers, listeners, and viewers is gradual, and it doesn't look the way most people expect. It's not a sudden influx of comments and shares. It's a slow accumulation of small interactions, a comment here, a survey response there, a conversation at an event, that over time weave together into something that feels less like broadcasting and more like a conversation. The professionals who build lasting authority aren't the ones who figured out the perfect engagement strategy. They're the ones who showed up, stayed accessible, asked genuine questions, and paid attention to what came back, even when what came back arrived in forms they hadn't anticipated and on timelines they couldn't control. If you'd like to read the article this episode is based on, you'll find that at Substack at Matty Dalrymple. And if you'd like to develop a personalized pathway from expertise to authority for yourself, please check out my consulting service at theindieauthor.com/authority. And if you're an event organizer, I'd love to share with your community a framework they can use to develop their own path. And if you'd like to get in touch, just drop me a note at matty@mattydalrymple.com. Thank you for listening.